In the shadowed corridors of power where ancient bloodlines meet modern wealth, loyalty can be bought, trust is a luxury, and even those sworn to protect can become the greatest threat. When centuries-old crown jewels vanish from an estate that has never been breached, the line between protector and predator blurs in ways that will shake the very foundations of the aristocracy. Some secrets are worth killing for, and some oaths are made to be broken. The morning mist clung to Raven's Hollow estate like a shroud, its tendrils weaving between the ancient oak trees that had stood sentinel for over 3 centuries. Lady Catherine Ashworth pulled her silk robe tighter as she gazed from her bedroom window across the sprawling grounds that had been in her family since the reign of Charles II. The estate's Gothic towers pierced the gray dawn sky, their stone facades weathered but proud, speaking of a legacy that had survived wars, scandals, and the changing tides of British history. At 42, Catherine possessed the kind of refined beauty that came from generations of careful breeding and unlimited resources. Her auburn hair caught the pale morning light as she moved through her private chambers, each step measured and deliberate. Today marked the anniversary of her late husband's death, and the weight of managing the Ashworth fortune alone still felt like a burden too heavy for her slender shoulders. The estate housed more than just her family's history. It contained secrets that could topple governments and treasures that museums would kill to display. The Ashworth Collection, as it was known in certain circles, included artifacts that officially didn't exist, paintings that had been lost during the war, and, most precious of all, the Crimson Crown jewels. These weren't the gaudy tourist attractions locked away in the Tower of London, but rather the true crown jewels of a deposed royal line, hidden away for safekeeping until the rightful heir could claim them. Catherine's grandfather had been entrusted with these treasures during the chaos of World War II, when royal families across Europe were fleeing from advancing armies. The jewels had remained at Raven's Hollow ever since, protected by layers of security that would make Fort Knox jealous. The collection included the blood ruby crown, with its centerpiece stone the size of a robin's egg, the Empress's necklace containing 47 perfect diamonds, and the sovereign's scepter adorned with sapphires that seemed to hold the very essence of the ocean within their depths. The security at Raven's Hollow was legendary. The estate employed a private army of guards, each one vetted through processes that would shame intelligence agencies. The perimeter was monitored by sensors so sensitive they could detect a sparrow landing on the fence. Motion detectors, thermal imaging, pressure plates, and biometric scanners created concentric circles of protection around the main house. The treasury itself was located in a vault that had been carved from solid bedrock beneath the estate's foundation, accessible only through a series of checkpoints that required multiple forms of authentication. Lord William Blackthorne, Catherine's closest friend since childhood and the executor of her late husband's estate, had been instrumental in designing these security measures. As a former military intelligence officer and current member of Parliament, William understood the delicate balance between protection and paranoia. His own estate bordered Raven's Hollow, and their families had been intertwined for generations through business, politics, and friendship. William possessed the kind of commanding presence that came naturally to men born into power. At 45, his black hair was touched with distinguished silver at the temples, and his steel-gray eyes missed nothing. He moved through political and social circles with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. His relationship with Catherine had always been complicated, too close for mere friendship, too valuable to risk with romance, especially given their respective positions in society. The head of security at Raven's Hollow was Marcus Thornfield, a man whose reputation in private military circles was both feared and respected. Thornfield had served in elite units across 3 continents before Catherine's husband had recruited him 5 years earlier. Standing 6 feet 4 inches with a build that spoke of countless hours in combat training, Thornfield commanded a team of 24 guards who worked in rotating shifts to ensure the estate was never unprotected. Thornfield's background was impressive by any standard. He had earned decorations in conflicts that officially never happened, and his expertise in security systems was matched only by his ability to anticipate threats that others couldn't even imagine. His team included specialists in electronics, former Special Forces operatives, and surveillance experts who had worked for government agencies around the world. Each guard underwent monthly polygraph tests, financial background checks, and psychological evaluations to ensure their continued reliability. The relationship between Thornfield and his employer had always been professional, but respectful. Catherine trusted him with her life and her family's legacy, while Thornfield took pride in maintaining a perfect security record. In 5 years, there had never been a single breach of the estate's defenses, not even a false alarm that couldn't be explained and corrected. However, beneath the surface of this perfectly orchestrated security operation, tensions had been building. Thornfield had recently discovered financial irregularities in the estate's accounts that suggested someone was siphoning funds for purposes that weren't immediately apparent. His attempts to discuss these concerns with Catherine had been repeatedly postponed due to her busy schedule managing the family's various business interests. The estate staff included dozens of employees, from groundskeepers and housekeepers to personal assistants and drivers. Each one had been carefully screened, and many had served the Ashworth family for decades. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, had been with the family for 37 years and knew every secret passage and hidden compartment in the ancient building. The groundskeepers maintained not just the visible gardens and lawns, but also the more secretive aspects of the estate's infrastructure, including the hidden sensors and camouflaged observation posts. Catherine's daily routine was precisely choreographed to maximize both her productivity and her security. She woke each morning at 6:30, spent an hour reviewing financial reports and correspondence, then took breakfast in her private dining room while receiving briefings from her various advisors. Her movements throughout the estate were tracked and coordinated with security protocols to ensure she was never in an unmonitored location. The treasury beneath the estate was a marvel of both engineering and security technology. The vault door alone weighed 6 tons and required 3 separate keys, each held by a different person, to open. Inside, the crown jewels were displayed in climate-controlled cases that monitored everything from temperature and humidity to vibration and electromagnetic fields. Any deviation from normal parameters would trigger immediate alarms and automatic lockdown procedures that would seal the vault for a minimum of 72 hours. The crimson crown jewels themselves were more than just precious stones and precious metals. They represented legitimacy, power, and a connection to divine authority that transcended mere monetary value. The blood ruby crown had been worn by 17 monarchs over 4 centuries, and legend claimed that it could only be worn by a true ruler without bringing misfortune upon the realm. The Empress's necklace had been a wedding gift from one royal house to another, sealing an alliance that had prevented a war that could have reshaped all of Europe. William's visits to Raven's Hollow were frequent and followed established patterns that the security team had long since incorporated into their routines. He typically arrived on Wednesday evenings for dinner and stayed until Friday morning, conducting business from Catherine's study while she managed her various charitable and political commitments. Their friendship provided both of them with emotional support in lives that were otherwise consumed by duty and responsibility. The two had known each other since they were children, attending the same exclusive boarding schools and spending summers at each other's family estates. William had been present at Catherine's wedding, had served as godfather to her son, and had been one of the few people she could lean on during her husband's illness and death. Their bond transcended romance or politics. It was built on shared experiences, mutual respect, and an understanding of the burdens that came with their positions in society. Catherine's son, James, was currently completing his education at Oxford, studying international relations, and preparing for his eventual role in managing the family's affairs. At 22, he possessed his mother's intelligence and his late father's strategic thinking, but he also had a rebellious streak that worried Catherine. James questioned many of the traditions and security measures that had defined his upbringing, arguing that the family should be more open about their charitable work and less secretive about their wealth. The estate's location in the Cotswolds provided natural advantages for security while maintaining the appearance of a typical English country manor. The rolling hills and dense woodlands made unauthorized approach nearly impossible without detection, while the estate's position at the end of a private road that stretched for 3 miles meant that any visitors had to pass through multiple checkpoints before reaching the main house. Local law enforcement had been carefully cultivated over the years through charitable donations and social connections. The chief constable was a regular guest at Catherine's dinner parties, and several of his officers had received training opportunities funded by the Ashworth Foundation. This relationship ensured rapid response times in case of emergency, while maintaining the discretion that the family's privacy required. The financial empire that supported Ravenshollow extended far beyond the estate itself. The Ashworth family controlled investments in technology, real estate, mining, and shipping that generated the resources necessary to maintain their lifestyle and security measures. Catherine personally managed portfolios worth hundreds of millions of pounds, while also overseeing charitable foundations that distributed millions more to causes ranging from education to environmental protection. As Catherine finished her morning routine and prepared for another day of managing her complex responsibilities, she had no way of knowing that the perfect security she had always taken for granted was about to be shattered. The chess pieces were already in motion for a game that would test every relationship, challenge every assumption, and reveal that the greatest threats often come from those we trust the most. The morning sun finally broke through the mist, casting long shadows across the estate grounds and illuminating the ancient stones that had protected the Ashworth family for generations. In just a few hours, Catherine would discover that all the money, all the technology, and all the careful planning in the world couldn't protect against the one thing she had never considered: betrayal from within the very heart of her security system. The alarm pierced the pre-dawn silence at exactly 4:43 in the morning, its shrill electronic wail echoing through the corridors of Ravenshollow Estate like the cry of a banshee. Catherine bolted upright in her four-poster bed, her heart hammering against her ribs as the reality of what she was hearing sank in. In 5 years, the Treasury alarm had never sounded. Not once, not even during routine testing, which was always conducted during daylight hours with full staff notification. Red emergency lights bathed her bedroom in an ominous glow as the estate's security protocols automatically engaged. Steel shutters began descending over every window with mechanical precision, sealing the manor house like a fortress under siege. The electromagnetic locks on all external doors engaged with audible clicks that seemed to echo through Catherine's bones. Within 60 seconds, Ravenshollow had transformed from an elegant country estate into an impenetrable stronghold. Catherine's hands trembled as she reached for the secure phone beside her bed, her mind racing through possibilities that all seemed equally impossible. The Treasury was located 40 feet below ground level, accessible only through a series of checkpoints that required biometric authentication, key cards, and physical keys that were never all in the same location simultaneously. The vault itself was equipped with sensors so sophisticated that they could detect changes in air pressure caused by someone breathing differently than normal. The phone rang only once before Marcus Thornfield's gravelly voice answered, though something in his tone immediately struck Catherine as wrong. Where she expected to hear the crisp professionalism of a security chief responding to a crisis, instead she detected what sounded almost like satisfaction. "Lady Ashworth, we have a situation," Thornfield said, his words carefully measured. "The Treasury has been breached. I'm implementing full lockdown protocols immediately. No one enters or leaves the estate until we understand exactly what's happened." Catherine felt her world tilting on its axis. "Breached? That's impossible, Marcus. You know as well as I do that the security systems have been compromised," Thornfield interrupted, his voice cutting through her protests like a blade. I'm afraid it appears we're dealing with someone who had intimate knowledge of our procedures and access to authorization codes that should have been impossible to obtain. The implications of his words hit Catherine like a physical blow. An inside job. Someone within her trusted circle had betrayed not just her personal safety, but centuries of family history and national security. The crown jewels weren't just valuable artifacts. They were symbols of legitimacy that could destabilize governments if they fell into the wrong hands. "I'll be right down," Catherine said, already moving toward her dressing room. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Thornfield replied, and now she could hear the steel beneath his polite tone. "Security protocols require that you remain in your quarters until the situation has been fully assessed. I'll send a team to escort you to the safe room." Catherine stopped moving, a chill running down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. In all her years of security briefings and emergency drills, she had never been told that she would be confined to her room during a crisis. The safe room was located in the basement level, near the treasury itself, exactly where she would expect to be taken to avoid whatever threat had triggered the alarms. "Marcus, I'm the owner of this estate and everything in it. I'm not staying locked in my bedroom while..." The line went dead. Catherine stared at the phone in her hand, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Thornfield had never interrupted her, never contradicted her direct instructions, and certainly never hung up on her. The man she had trusted with her life and her family's legacy had just revealed himself to be something else entirely. Moving quickly but quietly, Catherine abandoned her original plan to dress and instead grabbed the emergency bag that had been prepared for exactly this type of crisis. Hidden in the back of her closet behind a false panel, the bag contained clothes, emergency supplies, communication equipment, and, most importantly, backup access codes for every security system on the estate. Her late husband had insisted on these preparations, arguing that the greatest threats often came from within. The corridor outside her bedroom was empty, but Catherine could hear the heavy footsteps of guards moving through the house with purpose that seemed more like a military operation than a response to theft. The emergency lighting cast weird shadows that made familiar spaces seem alien and threatening. She moved toward the back staircase that few people knew existed, a narrow servant's passage that connected all floors of the ancient manor. As she descended the hidden stairs, Catherine's mind raced through everything she knew about Thornfield and his team. The man had been thoroughly investigated before being hired, his background checked, and verified through multiple intelligence agencies. His financial records were spotless, his psychological evaluations perfect, and his references from previous positions had been glowing. Yet somehow, he had orchestrated the impossible, a theft from a vault that was supposedly more secure than the crown jewels themselves. The servant's staircase emerged into a pantry adjacent to the kitchen, where Catherine hoped to access the estate's secondary communication system. Every room in Ravenhollow was equipped with multiple communication options, a redundancy that now seemed prescient rather than paranoid. But as she reached for the emergency phone mounted inside a cabinet, she found only severed wires and empty mounting brackets. "Looking for something, Lady Catherine?" She spun around to find two men in security uniforms blocking the pantry's exit, their faces hidden behind tactical masks that transformed them from familiar employees into anonymous threats. Both carried weapons that she recognized as standard issue for the estate security force, but their posture and bearings suggested military training that went far beyond civilian security work. "Where is Marcus?" Catherine demanded, drawing on decades of aristocratic authority to keep her voice steady. "I want to speak with him immediately." "Mr. Thornfield is currently busy managing the situation," one of the guards replied, his accent revealing origins far from the local counties where Ravenshollow's staff was typically recruited. "He's asked us to escort you to a secure location for your protection." Catherine's eyes darted around the pantry, calculating distances and options with the kind of strategic thinking that had been drilled into her from childhood. The Ashworth family had survived centuries of political upheaval by never fully trusting anyone and always maintaining multiple escape routes. The pantry had 3 exits, but 2 were now blocked by armed men who clearly had no intention of allowing her to move freely through her own home. "I appreciate your concern for my safety," Catherine said, stepping backward toward the 3rd exit that led to the wine cellar. "But I prefer to remain in my own quarters during this crisis." "I'm afraid that's not an option," the second guard said, raising his weapon slightly in what could have been interpreted as either a casual adjustment or a subtle threat. Mr. Thornfield was very specific about his instructions. The wine cellar exit was only 6 feet away, but Catherine knew that any sudden movement would likely provoke a response she wasn't prepared to handle. Instead, she decided to probe for information that might reveal the scope of what she was facing. "How many of the crown jewels were taken?" she asked, watching their faces for any reaction. The guards exchanged a glance that told Catherine everything she needed to know. This wasn't a theft that had been discovered and was now being investigated. It was an operation that was still in progress, and she was apparently a key component of whatever plan was being executed. "That information is classified pending the completion of our investigation," the first guard replied, but his tone suggested he was following a script rather than making real-time decisions. Catherine realized with crystal clarity that she was no longer the owner of Raven's Hollow estate. She had become a prisoner in her own home, held by people who had spent years earning her trust while planning her betrayal. The question now was whether this was simply an elaborate theft or whether the crown jewels were just the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous. The ancient stones of Raven's Hollow had protected the Ashworth family through civil wars, world wars, and political revolutions, but they offered no defense against the enemy within. As Catherine weighed her options and prepared to make a choice that would determine whether she lived to see another sunrise, she could only wonder how many others she had trusted were now working against her, and whether anyone was left who might come to her aid. Outside, the morning mist was beginning to lift, revealing grounds that looked deceptively peaceful and normal. But inside the estate's walls, a drama was unfolding that would test everything Catherine had learned about survival, loyalty, and the price of power in a world where trust was the most valuable and dangerous commodity of all. The game had begun, and Catherine was no longer sure which side she was playing for, or even if she was a player at all. The only thing she knew with certainty was that the next few hours would determine not just the fate of her family's legacy, but whether the Ashworth line would survive to see another generation. The wine cellar stretched beneath Raven's Hollow, like a subterranean cathedral, its vaulted stone ceilings disappearing into shadows that even the emergency lighting couldn't fully penetrate. Catherine moved through the maze of ancient oak barrels and climate-controlled storage units with the familiarity of someone who had explored every corner of the estate since childhood. Her bare feet made no sound on the worn flagstones as she navigated toward a destination that even Marcus Thornfield didn't know existed. Behind her, she could hear the guards searching with increasing urgency, their tactical flashlights cutting through the darkness like accusatory fingers. They were professionals, but they were also strangers to the estate's secrets, while Catherine had grown up playing hide and seek in these very tunnels. The advantage was small, but in her current situation, she would take whatever edge she could get. The hidden passage she sought was concealed behind a wine rack that had been installed in 1847, during a period when the Ashworth family had been involved in smuggling operations that helped fund the estate during a particularly difficult economic period. The mechanism that opened the passage required knowledge of a specific sequence. 3 bottles that had to be pulled in the correct order, mimicking the opening notes of a piece of music that had been the family's private anthem for over 2 centuries. As her fingers found the familiar bottles, Catherine's mind was already racing ahead to what she would find beyond the passage. The family's true safe room wasn't the obvious bunker that had been constructed during the estate's recent security upgrades. It was a chamber that dated back to the English Civil War, when the Ashworth family had needed to hide from Cromwell's forces. The room contained communication equipment that operated on frequencies unknown to the current security team, along with weapons and supplies that could sustain one person for weeks if necessary. The passage opened silently, revealing a narrow tunnel that sloped downward through the estate's foundation. Catherine slipped inside and carefully closed the entrance behind her, engaging locks that hadn't been used in decades but still functioned with the precision of Swiss clockwork. Even if the guards found the passage, it would take them hours to break through barriers that had been designed to withstand military assault. The tunnel was barely wide enough for one person, its walls carved from the same stone that formed the estate's foundation. Emergency lighting strips, installed during renovations in the 1990s, provided just enough illumination to navigate safely. As Catherine moved deeper underground, she could feel the weight of centuries of Ashworth history pressing down on her, reminding her that she was just the latest in a line of women and men who had faced impossible odds and somehow survived. The true safe room was larger than she remembered from her childhood explorations, its walls lined with equipment that ranged from antique to cutting edge. A bank of monitors displayed feeds from security cameras that the current security team didn't know existed, providing Catherine with her first clear picture of what was happening throughout her estate. What she saw made her blood run cold. Thornfield wasn't just stealing the crown jewels. He was systematically looting every valuable item in the estate while his team conducted what appeared to be a military-style occupation. Guards she had trusted for years were working with practiced efficiency to pack artwork, documents, and artifacts into unmarked vehicles that had been positioned throughout the grounds. This wasn't a simple theft. It was the complete liquidation of everything the Ashworth family had accumulated over 3 centuries. But the most chilling image was on the monitor showing the treasury itself. Thornfield stood before the open vault, but he wasn't alone. A woman Catherine didn't recognize was photographing each piece of the crown jewel collection with professional equipment, while a man in an expensive suit examined the artifacts with the practiced eye of an expert appraiser. These weren't common thieves. They were professionals who knew exactly what they were stealing and had customers already lined up for the merchandise. Catherine activated the secure communication system and immediately tried to contact Lord William Blackthorne. If anyone could organize a response to what was happening at Ravens Hollow, it would be William, with his connections to intelligence services and law enforcement agencies. But as she waited for the connection to establish, she realized with growing horror that the system was showing no available channels. All external communications had been completely severed. Switching to the emergency frequency that connected directly to local law enforcement, Catherine found only static. The communication jamming was so complete that it could only have been accomplished with military-grade equipment and detailed knowledge of every system the estate employed. Thornfield hadn't just betrayed her trust. He had planned this operation with the precision of a military campaign. The monitors showed that the theft was nearly complete. Vehicles were beginning to leave the estate grounds using routes that avoided the main gate and its surveillance systems. Catherine watched helplessly as centuries of her family's legacy disappeared into the night. But she also began to notice patterns in the operation that suggested it hadn't gone entirely according to plan. Several of the vehicles were taking longer than expected to load, and she could see guards checking their watches with obvious concern. Radio chatter that she could monitor through the security system indicated that they were running behind schedule, though she couldn't understand why until she noticed something that made her heart race with hope. One of the vehicles had broken down near the estate's eastern boundary, and the guards were having to transfer its cargo to other trucks that were already fully loaded. The breakdown was creating a bottleneck that was forcing the entire operation to slow down, giving Catherine more time to act and potentially allowing authorities to arrive before everyone escaped. But first, she had to find a way to contact the outside world. Catherine turned to equipment that she had hoped never to use, a radio system that operated on frequencies reserved for emergency services and had been installed as a final backup during the estate's construction. The system was completely separate from the estate's normal communications and drew power from its own generator, making it nearly impossible to jam or disable without physical access to this hidden chamber. As she powered up the radio, Catherine noticed something on the monitors that made her freeze. William's distinctive Bentley was approaching the estate's main gate, but instead of being stopped by the security protocols that should have prevented anyone from entering during a lockdown. The guards were waving him through. Her closest friend and confidant was arriving at Raven's Hollow in the middle of the night during a crisis, and the people who had imprisoned her were treating him like an expected guest. The implications hit her like a physical blow. William wasn't coming to rescue her. He was part of the operation. The man she had trusted with her deepest secrets, who had helped design the very security systems that were being used against her, who had been present for every major decision about the crown jewel's protection, was one of the architects of her betrayal. Catherine's hands shook as she tried to process the scope of the conspiracy she was facing. This wasn't just about Thornfield or a handful of corrupt guards. This was a betrayal that reached into the highest levels of British society, involving people with access to resources and information that could only come from government or intelligence connections. The radio crackled to life, and Catherine found herself connected to an emergency dispatch center that could coordinate a response to what was happening at Raven's Hollow. But as she prepared to speak, she realized that she didn't know who else might be involved in the conspiracy. Local law enforcement, intelligence agencies, government officials, any of them might be compromised, and contacting the wrong person could seal her fate. Instead, Catherine made a decision that went against every instinct for seeking help from established authorities. She would contact someone completely outside the system, someone with no official connections, but with resources and motivations that aligned with her own survival. She thought of James, her son at Oxford, who had connections to journalists and activists who specialized in exposing corruption at the highest levels of society. But first, she had to survive long enough to reach him. The monitors showed William entering the estate's main house, where he was being escorted not to the areas where a legitimate rescue operation would focus, but directly toward the treasury level where the real prize was waiting. Catherine realized with crystalline clarity that she was the only person who knew the full scope of what was happening, and if she didn't act quickly, both she and the truth would disappear forever. The chamber where she was hiding contained more than just communication equipment. It also housed weapons that the Ashworth family had collected over centuries of preparing for exactly this kind of betrayal. Catherine selected items that would serve her immediate needs. A pistol that was modern enough to be reliable, but old enough to not be registered in any database, along with equipment that would allow her to move through the estate undetected. As she prepared to leave the safety of the hidden chamber, Catherine took one last look at the monitors showing the systematic destruction of everything her family had built. William was now visible in the treasury, examining the crown jewels with the same professional detachment as the other conspirators. The man she had considered family was evaluating her family's most precious possessions like a businessman appraising inventory. The game had changed completely. Catherine was no longer just trying to protect her property or even her life. She was fighting to expose a conspiracy that reached into the heart of British society, involving people with the power to rewrite history and eliminate anyone who stood in their way. The question now wasn't whether she could save the crown jewels, but whether she could survive long enough to ensure that the truth would eventually come to light. The pre-dawn darkness outside Raven's Hollow estate provided perfect cover as Catherine emerged from a concealed exit that hadn't been used since World War II, when her grandfather had employed similar tactics to evade Nazi sympathizers who had infiltrated local government. The ancient drainage tunnel deposited her in a grove of trees nearly 200 yards from the main house, far enough to avoid immediate detection, but close enough to observe the ongoing operation. From her hidden position, Catherine could see the scope of the betrayal with devastating clarity. William's Bentley was parked alongside several unmarked vehicles that were being loaded with artifacts and documents by guards she had trusted with her life. Spotlights had been positioned to illuminate the loading areas, creating an efficiency that spoke of months of planning and preparation. This wasn't a spontaneous theft. It was a carefully orchestrated operation designed to strip away every trace of the Ashworth family's legacy. Catherine counted at least 12 vehicles involved in the operation, ranging from luxury cars that could transport the most valuable items without attracting attention, to commercial trucks that could handle bulkier artifacts and furniture. The coordination was military in its precision, with guards communicating through headsets and following predetermined schedules that minimized exposure and maximized efficiency. But Catherine also noticed signs that the operation wasn't proceeding entirely according to plan. The breakdown she had observed earlier was creating a cascade of delays that forced the team to improvise solutions that weren't part of their original timeline. Guards were checking their watches with increasing frequency, and the radio chatter she could monitor suggested growing concern about maintaining their schedule. More importantly, she could see that the theft was so extensive that it would be impossible to complete before daylight, made the operation too visible to continue undetected. The conspirators had been too ambitious in their scope, trying to steal not just the crown jewels, but virtually every valuable item the estate contained. Their greed was creating an opportunity for Catherine to exploit. Moving carefully through the pre-dawn darkness, Catherine made her way toward the estate's vehicle storage building, where her personal cars were kept along with maintenance equipment and fuel supplies. If she could reach the building undetected, she would have access to transportation and communication equipment that the conspirators might not have thought to disable. The journey required crossing 200 yards of open ground while avoiding patrols that were following patterns she had learned during years of security briefings. Catherine's knowledge of the estate's layout was her greatest advantage. She knew every hiding spot, every shadow, and every route that could provide concealment from the surveillance systems that were now being used against her. As she moved, Catherine's mind was already planning her next steps. Getting off the estate alive was only the first challenge. She also needed to reach people who could expose the conspiracy and prevent the crown jewels from disappearing forever into private collections or black market transactions. The theft wasn't just about money. It was about erasing history and eliminating symbols of legitimacy that had political implications far beyond their monetary value. The vehicle storage building loomed ahead, its familiar bulk offering the promise of safety and escape. But as Catherine approached the structure, she noticed something that made her blood freeze. Fresh tire tracks in the gravel indicated that someone had been using the building recently, and lights were visible through windows that should have been dark at this hour. Circling the building carefully, Catherine found a position where she could observe the interior through a window that had been left partially open. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. Two of Thornfield's men were systematically destroying every vehicle in the building, disabling engines, and slashing tires with professional thoroughness. They weren't just stealing from her. They were ensuring that she couldn't escape or pursue them. But the saboteurs had made one crucial mistake. They were working methodically from one end of the building toward the other, which meant that the vehicles at the far end were still intact. Catherine's motorcycle, a powerful machine she used for rides through the countryside, was parked in the corner that the saboteurs hadn't reached yet. The challenge was reaching the motorcycle without being detected by two men who were specifically watching for intruders. Catherine studied their movements, looking for patterns and blind spots that she could exploit. The men were professionals, but they were also focused on their assigned task of vehicle destruction, which meant their attention was concentrated on the work rather than perimeter security. Catherine made her move during a moment when both saboteurs were focused on a particularly difficult engine component. Slipping through the partially open window with the silence of someone who had spent her childhood playing elaborate games of stealth throughout the estate. The motorcycle was only 30 feet away, but those 30 feet represented the difference between freedom and capture. As she reached the motorcycle, Catherine realized that starting the engine would immediately alert the saboteurs to her presence, giving them time to react before she could escape the building. Instead, she would have to rely on the element of complete surprise, starting the bike and accelerating toward the exit before they could organize a response. The motorcycle roared to life with a sound that seemed to shake the entire building, causing both saboteurs to spin around in shock. Catherine gunned the engine and shot toward the building's main exit, betting everything on speed and their momentary confusion. Behind her, she could hear shouts and the sound of weapons being drawn, but she was already through the doorway and accelerating across the estate grounds. The pursuit began immediately. Catherine could see headlights activating throughout the estate as guards responded to radio calls reporting her escape. But she also had advantages that her pursuers lacked: intimate knowledge of every trail and path on the estate, a motorcycle that could travel routes impassable to larger vehicles, and the desperation of someone fighting for her life and legacy. Catherine's destination was the estate's eastern boundary, with a broken-down vehicle was creating the bottleneck that had disrupted the thieves' timeline. If she could reach that position, she might be able to use the confusion to slip past the perimeter and reach the main road where she could contact authorities or find help. The chase through the estate grounds was like a deadly game of cat and mouse, with Catherine using every advantage of terrain and knowledge to stay ahead of vehicles that were faster and more numerous but less maneuverable. She cut through wooded areas where cars couldn't follow, jumped irrigation ditches that forced her pursuers to find longer routes, and used hidden paths that she had explored during decades of living on the estate. But her pursuers were professionals with resources that eventually began to tell. Radio coordination allowed them to position vehicles to cut off her escape routes, while spotlights and night vision equipment negated some of her advantages in the darkness. Catherine realized that she was running out of options and time. Dawn was approaching, which would make her easier to track while also forcing the conspirators to accelerate their timeline. The eastern boundary came into view just as Catherine's fuel gauge indicated that the motorcycle was nearly empty. The breakdown that had been disrupting the thieves' operation was still creating confusion, with guards trying to reorganize their transportation while maintaining security around the vehicles that were still loading stolen goods. Catherine made a decision that went against every survival instinct. Instead of trying to escape past the perimeter, she would attack the operation at its most vulnerable point. The broken-down vehicle contained some of the most valuable artifacts from the estate, and its disabled state meant that the guards were focused on protecting its contents rather than watching for external threats. As she approached the cluster of vehicles and guards, Catherine realized that she had one final advantage that might turn the entire situation in her favor. Her phone, which she had grabbed during her escape from the manor house, had been automatically recording everything that had happened since the alarms began. The video and audio evidence would be enough to expose the conspiracy, but only if she could survive long enough to transmit it to someone who could act on the information. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Catherine knew that everything depended on the next few minutes. The sun was beginning to rise over Raven's Hollow estate, casting long shadows across grounds that had witnessed centuries of Ashworth history. Soon, those same grounds would host a battle that would determine whether that history would continue or end forever. The eastern boundary of Raven's Hollow estate erupted into chaos as Catherine's motorcycle burst from the tree line directly toward the cluster of vehicles, where guards were frantically trying to redistribute stolen artifacts from the broken-down truck. Her sudden appearance caught everyone completely off guard. They had been so focused on their internal logistics problem that they hadn't maintained proper perimeter security. Catherine had one chance to make her desperate plan work. Instead of trying to fight 12 armed guards with superior weapons and training, she aimed directly for the weakest point in their operation, the communications equipment truck that was coordinating the entire theft. If she could disable their ability to communicate with each other and with whoever was directing the operation from inside the estate, she might be able to create enough confusion to level the playing field. The motorcycle hit the communications truck at 60 miles per hour, sending both machine and rider flying in different directions as electronics and antenna arrays exploded in showers of sparks and twisted metal. Catherine rolled hard, feeling ribs crack and consciousness flicker, but adrenaline and desperation kept her moving even as guards rushed toward the impact site with weapons drawn. The destruction of the communications truck had immediate effects throughout the operation. Guards throughout the estate suddenly found themselves cut off from central coordination, forced to make individual decisions without knowing what was happening elsewhere. The carefully orchestrated theft began to unravel as different teams started working at cross purposes, some trying to complete their assigned tasks, while others moved to investigate the commotion at the eastern boundary. Catherine crawled behind the wreckage of the communications truck, using its bulk as cover while she assessed her situation. Her phone had survived the crash, still recording everything and maintaining its connection to the cellular network through a signal booster that the conspirators hadn't thought to disable. She had minutes, maybe less, before the guards organized themselves enough to overwhelm her position. With shaking hands, Catherine began transmitting everything she had recorded to multiple recipients. Her son James at Oxford, investigative journalists she had worked with on charitable projects, and government officials whose loyalty she believed couldn't have been compromised. The files were large, and the signal was weak, but the transmission began just as the guards started moving toward her position with the systematic precision of a military assault. "Lady Catherine." The voice belonged to William Blackthorne, who had arrived at the eastern boundary with reinforcements from the main house. "This is madness. You're going to get yourself killed for objects that can be replaced. Just surrender, and we can work something out." Catherine almost laughed at the absurdity of his words. Objects that could be replaced? The crown jewels represented legitimacy that dated back centuries, family artifacts that connected her to ancestors who had shaped the course of British history, documents that contained secrets that could destabilize governments if they were made public. These weren't just valuable items. They were the foundation of everything she was, and everything her family had ever stood for. "Surrender to whom?" "William," she called back, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded despite her injuries and desperate circumstances. "To the man I trusted as family? To the security chief I paid to protect my life? To guards I treated as friends? Exactly who do you think I should trust at this point?" The guards were close enough now that Catherine could hear their tactical discussions as they planned their final assault on her position. But she could also hear something else. Sirens in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Someone had received her transmissions and was responding with authorities that were outside the conspiracy's control. William's voice took on a more urgent tone. "Catherine, you don't understand the forces you're dealing with here. This operation has backing from people who can make problems disappear permanently. If you cooperate, you'll be allowed to live quietly somewhere far away from here. If you continue to fight, you'll be eliminated along with anyone else who might have inconvenient knowledge about what happened tonight." The threat was clear, but it also contained information that Catherine filed away for future use. This conspiracy reached beyond William and Thornfield to people with resources that included government connections and the ability to eliminate witnesses. She wasn't just fighting for her property. She was fighting against a network that had penetrated the highest levels of British society. The sirens were definitely getting closer, but Catherine realized that the approaching authorities might not be the rescue she was hoping for. If the conspiracy included people with government connections, then responding police units might be under orders to eliminate her rather than protect her. She needed to survive long enough to determine whether help was arriving or whether the threat was just changing form. Catherine's phone chimed softly, indicating that her transmissions had been completed successfully. Somewhere in the outside world, people now had evidence of everything that had happened at Ravenshollow Estate. Even if she didn't survive the next few minutes, the truth would eventually emerge, and the conspirators would face consequences for their actions. But Catherine had no intention of becoming a martyr if she could avoid it. The wreckage around her contained more than just communications equipment. It also included some of the artifacts that had been loaded onto the truck before it broke down. Catherine's hands closed around an object that made her heart race with recognition. The sovereign scepter, one of the crown jewels that represented the heart of her family's responsibilities. If she was going to die defending these artifacts, at least she would die holding one of them. The guards made their move just as the first police vehicles came into view on the main road leading to the estate. Catherine found herself caught between two forces that were converging on her position, with no clear way to determine which represented safety and which represented another threat to eliminate her. The next few minutes played out like a deadly ballet, with guards trying to capture Catherine while also preparing to escape before police units could cut off their retreat routes. Catherine used every piece of cover available, moving from wreckage to tree line to abandoned equipment while keeping the scepter clutched against her chest like a talisman. But as the police vehicles drew closer, Catherine began to notice details that filled her with hope rather than dread. The responding units were from multiple agencies that would be nearly impossible to coordinate if they were part of the conspiracy. Local police, county sheriff's units, and what appeared to be federal investigators were all converging on Ravens Hollow with the kind of response that suggested they had received credible intelligence about a major crime in progress. William's voice rang out across the battlefield one final time. "Catherine, this is your last chance. Come with us now, or face the consequences of destroying relationships that took decades to build." Catherine's response was to stand up from behind her cover, holding the sovereign's scepter high above her head where the approaching authorities could clearly see it. The symbolism was unmistakable. She was the rightful guardian of these artifacts, while the people surrounding her were thieves who had betrayed every trust placed in them. The confrontation ended not with gunfire or dramatic speeches, but with the simple reality that the conspirators were outnumbered and outgunned by authorities who had arrived in force. Guards began surrendering or attempting to escape as police units established perimeters and began the systematic process of taking control of the crime scene. William Blackthorne was among the last to surrender, staring at Catherine with an expression that combined rage, disappointment, and something that might have been respect. "You have no idea what you've done," he said as officers approached him with handcuffs. "The people behind this operation don't forgive, and they don't forget. This isn't over." Catherine met his gaze without flinching. "You're right," she replied. "It isn't over. It's just beginning. Every person involved in this conspiracy will be exposed, every stolen item will be recovered, and everyone who betrayed the trust placed in them will face the consequences of their actions." As the sun rose fully over Ravens Hollow estate, Catherine found herself surrounded by investigators, paramedics, and crime scene technicians who were beginning the long process of documenting everything that had happened during the night. The crown jewels would be recovered, the conspirators would face justice, and the estate would eventually return to its role as guardian of centuries of British history. But Catherine also knew that William's warning contained truth. Conspiracies that reached this deep into the establishment wouldn't simply disappear because one operation had been exposed. The battle for Ravens Hollow had been won, but the larger war for truth and justice was just beginning. As she was helped into an ambulance for treatment of her injuries, Catherine was already planning her next moves in a conflict that would define the rest of her life. The ancient stones of Ravens Hollow had witnessed another chapter in the Ashworth family's long history of survival against impossible odds. The estate would endure, the crown jewels would remain under proper protection, and the legacy would continue. But Catherine now understood that some battles never truly end. They just evolve into new forms that require eternal vigilance to win.